They called her the decorative pilot, a pretty face for photos, a smile for propaganda, on the razor's edge of Italy's battlefields. Lieutenant Anne Calloway was mocked, sidelined, and deemed unfit to fly. But when smoke swallowed the runway, when 12 wounded soldiers faced death, she did what no one dared. She seized the controls, defied prejudice, and wrote history. This is the story of a woman underestimated, yet she soared above them all. Welcome to our channel. Before we dive into this powerful story, let me know in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you think stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support us. In 1944, Italy's battlefields were choked with fire and smoke. The brutal fighting at Cassino pushed the U.S. Air Force to its limits. At a small base in southern Italy, the air was taut as a bowstring. Planes roared day and night, carrying the wounded supplies and sometimes fragile hope. Amid this chaos stood a young woman, Lieutenant Anne Calloway, 27 with sharp eyes and a confident stride. She wore her pilot's uniform like it was made for her, flight cap tucked under her arm. But those around her only smirked. "She looks great in that flight suit," an officer remarked, half joking, half dismissive. That's all they need her for. Anne was no novice. She'd conquered the grueling training of the WASP program, Women Air Force Service pilots with an A-class flight certification. Something not every male pilot achieved. She could handle a P-51 Mustang in test flights and stay calm when engines shuddered at 10,000 feet. But here, at this base, she wasn't seen as a real pilot. Instead, she was cast as decoration. They sent her up for press stunts, posing by planes for recruitment posters, or ferrying unimportant mail between bases. "She's here to make the posters look good," a young pilot whispered to his buddy, their chuckles echoing in the mess hall. Anne heard those words. She saw the pitying glances, the head shakes as she passed in the corridors. "Pretty girls don't need to fly into battle," an older lieutenant said, his tone dripping with condescension. She didn't reply. She only clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, and kept walking. But deep down, she knew she didn't belong in glossy photos or pointless stunts. She belonged in the cockpit, in the sky, where the engine's roar drowned out every sneer, every morning. Anne stood before a C-47 Skytrain, inspecting its wings, engines, and controls with a craftsman's care. She did it not because anyone ordered her to, but because she believed one day they'd need her, truly need her. Yet day after day, she got trivial assignments. "Calloway, take this mail to Naples," an officer commanded, barely glancing at her, "and wear a clean uniform. The press might snap a picture." She nodded, but her eyes betrayed her frustration. Male pilots were sent to evacuate the wounded or deliver supplies through combat zones, while she was stuck with aimless flights. At the base, the atmosphere for female pilots like Anne was always heavy. Young soldiers eyed her with curiosity tinged with doubt. Senior officers were blunter. "She flies well, but war's no place for women," a colonel said during a briefing. Anne wasn't invited to those meetings, but she heard. She always heard, and each time she told herself just one chance. That's all I need. The airbase in southern Italy in those days was like a giant machine, never stopping. Engines roared from dawn, the smell of fuel mixing with dust rising from red dirt roads. The fighting at Cassino was at its peak, and every day dozens of wounded soldiers were brought back from the front, blood soaking their bandages, eyes hollow. The C-47 Skytrains with their silver-gray bodies were the only hope to get them to safe field hospitals. But that required seasoned pilots, ones who could navigate through swirling valley winds. Under the range of German artillery, Lieutenant Anne Calloway stood in the camp, watching the C-47s prepped for missions. She knew today was critical. An emergency evacuation order had been issued. 12 wounded soldiers needed to reach Naples immediately. She gripped her flight cap, filled with resolve. "I can do this," she told herself, her gaze sweeping over the male pilots gathered near the planes, laughing and slapping shoulders. She marched to the command office, where assignments were given, and spoke clearly, her voice steady. "Sir, I request to join the evacuation flight." The officer looked up, eyebrows slightly raised. He glanced at her, then at the list. "Calloway, right. You'll go with Captain Banks. As co-pilot." Anne nodded, though she knew what co-pilot meant. She wouldn't touch the controls, wouldn't make decisions. She'd just sit there, taking notes, checking gauges, doing whatever Captain Banks ordered. But she didn't refuse. A chance, however small, was still a chance. Captain Raymond Banks was a veteran pilot with over a decade of experience in hundreds of combat flights. Tall, with a voice like thunder. He was known for his tough stance, especially toward female pilots. "Women don't belong in the cockpit," he'd said one evening at the officers' club, half a whiskey gone. Anne heard it, but she didn't let it stop her. She met Banks by the C-47, saluting crisply. He barely nodded, his eyes skimming over her like she was a decoration. "You know your job, Calloway?" he asked, voice flat. "Yes, sir," she replied, clutching her clipboard. In the cockpit, Anne was given simple tasks: check cabin pressure, log flight details, and communicate with the tower via radio. She did everything with precision, but never once touched the main controls. Banks sat in the pilot's seat, hands guiding the yoke with the confidence of someone who owned the wartime sky. Anne watched him, memorizing every move, every decision. She knew she could do the same, maybe better. But she stayed silent, eyes fixed on the dashboard. There was a moment, during pre-flight checks, when Anne noticed a slight error in the flight path. She spoke, voice calm. "Sir, I think we should recheck the route through the valley. There's a ridge that could cause wind shear." Banks turned, a cold smile curling his lips. "No need to worry about that, little lady. Just hold on to your clipboard." He stressed little lady to remind her of her place. Anne said nothing more. She nodded, but inside, a small fire burned. She knew she wasn't just a note-taker. She was a pilot, and she'd prove it. As the C-47 was rolled to the runway, Anne sat in the co-pilot's seat, headset on, eyes tracking Banks' every move. She heard the engines fire up, felt the plane's vibrations through her seat. Outside, soldiers loaded the wounded into the rear. 12 men, some unconscious, some groaning in pain, their wounds severe. A head nurse, face weary but resolute, boarded with her medical kit. This wasn't just a flight. It was life or death for those lying behind them. Anne glanced out the cockpit window, seeing the horizon glow red with sunset. She knew this flight wouldn't be easy. Treacherous terrain, unstable weather, and the constant threat of German artillery loomed. But she wasn't afraid. She was ready for whatever came. The only thing she didn't expect was that Captain Banks, the man in control, would soon face his own limits. And when that moment came, Anne would have to step up, whether he liked it or not. The C-47 Skytrain roared, slicing through Italy's sky, stained red by the sunset. In the cockpit, the air was heavy, broken only by the steady hum of engines and the clatter of radio equipment. Lieutenant Anne Calloway sat in the co-pilot's seat, headset clamped on, hands swiftly noting data from the dashboard. Captain Raymond Banks, face as hard as stone, gripped the yoke, eyes locked on the horizon. Behind them, in the cargo hold, 12 wounded soldiers lay on stretchers, some moaning in pain, others unconscious from blood loss. The head nurse, hands moving deftly, darted between stretchers, checking pulses, changing bandages, fighting to keep them alive for one more hour. Their destination was the field airport in Naples, where doctors waited, but everyone knew the path there was far from easy. Anne felt the tension in the air. She glanced out the window, seeing the jagged mountains of southern Italy sprawling below, swirling winds forming wisps of white clouds. She knew this terrain was treacherous, especially as darkness crept in. She checked the clock about 40 minutes to the landing point, but something was off. Through her headset, the signal from Naples' control tower flickered, interrupted by constant static. Anne frowned, adjusting the frequency, trying to reconnect. "Sir," she said, voice calm but firm, "comms are spotty. Should we check the backup airfield? Banks didn't turn," he muttered, irritation clear. "They'll clear the runway for us. It's a war zone. Smoke's normal." Anne disagreed. She looked out again, and this time, she saw a plume of black smoke rising from Naples' direction. Not ordinary dust, but thick, swirling, ominous. She wanted to speak, but she knew Banks wouldn't listen. He was in command, and he didn't want a co-pilot like her interfering. In the hold, a wounded soldier's groan rose, long and agonizing. The head nurse shouted through the intercom, "We need to land soon. This one won't last long." Anne glanced back, catching the nurse's desperate eyes through the cockpit door's gap. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. 12 lives behind them, each one hanging by a thread. And she knew this flight wasn't just a mission, it was a race against time. The plane pressed on, descending as they neared Naples. Anne kept her eyes on the instruments, noting every slight change. She noticed something: the left engine's temperature was creeping up. Subtle, but enough to raise her guard. She wanted to tell Banks, but he was yelling into the radio, trying to reach the tower. "Naples. This is Charlie 902. Confirm runway," he bellowed, meeting only with static. Anne's heart beat faster. She didn't like this, not one bit. Then she saw it clearly: the black smoke wasn't just a streak now, but a massive column, billowing from the airfield's direction. "Sir," she said, voice sharper now, "that smoke's not normal. The runway might have been hit." Banks turned, looking at her directly for the first time, but his eyes were full of doubt. "You think you know better than me, Calloway?" he asked, tone mocking. "Do your job, take notes. I'll handle the rest." Anne went silent, but her mind raced. She knew Naples airfield was close to German artillery lines. A sudden attack wasn't impossible. She recalled the flight map she'd studied for hours before boarding, despite Banks telling her it wasn't needed. A backup option flashed in her mind. Delta II, a narrower, riskier airstrip, just a few miles from Naples, possibly still safe. She'd never landed there, but she'd flown over it during display runs, and she knew its terrain by heart. She wanted to tell Banks about Delta II, but he was arguing with the radio. "Naples. Answer." "Damn it," he shouted, slamming a fist on the dashboard. Anne watched him, noticing sweat beading on his brow despite the cool cockpit. She realized something: Captain Banks, the veteran pilot everyone revered, was starting to crack. And in the hold, the wounded soldiers' groans grew fainter, as if time itself was running out. Anne took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't stay passive any longer. If Banks didn't act, she'd have to. She didn't know that, in just a few minutes, everything would change, not just for her, But for everyone on this plane, the wartime sky showed no mercy, and Anne Calloway was about to face the greatest challenge of her life. The C-47 Skytrain swooped low over the last mountain ridges, its engines roaring as if to drown out the tension in the cockpit. Lieutenant Anne Calloway sat still, hands gripping her clipboard, eyes fixed on the thick black smoke coiling from the direction of Naples airfield. 2 minutes to landing, but everything was falling apart. The radio crackled to life, the controller's urgent voice blaring through the headsets. Charlie 9er 2. Bravo runway destroyed, German artillery just hit. Divert immediately. Repeat, divert. The warning cut through the air like a knife in the cockpit. Captain Raymond Banks froze. His hands stayed on the yoke, but his eyes darted as if unable to process the news. Divert, he muttered, voice trembling. Divert where we don't have enough fuel. Anne glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle hovered in the red. Enough for 30 minutes, no more. The nearest base, Foggia, was an hour away. They had no chance. From the hold, the head nurse's shout pierced the intercom. Too much bleeding. We need to land now, or this one's gone. A wounded soldier was convulsing, his breath shallow, and Anne knew the 12 lives in the back hung by a thread. Banks started muttering, his voice near panic. Runway destroyed, no way to land. We have to circle back. But he made no decisions, just repeated himself and lost. Anne watched him, seeing sweat stream down his temples, his hands shaking as he tried to adjust the yoke. She knew he'd flown hundreds of missions, but in this moment, the veteran pilot was crumbling. Fire and smoke from Bravo runway rose ahead, a wall of death blocking all hope. Anne didn't wait. She took a deep breath, her voice sharp and decisive. Sir, we can land at Delta 2. The auxiliary strip is 3 miles away. I've flown over it. It's narrow, but intact. Banks whipped around, eyes bloodshot, yelling, "Are you insane? Calloway, Delta 2's a dirt patch in a junkyard." No one lands there, but Anne didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her voice calm but forceful. We have no choice. If we don't land, everyone dies. Banks shook his head, his hands trembling harder, the yoke jerking, making the plane wobble. "You're not cleared to fly, I'm the pilot," he shouted, but his voice cracked, stripped of authority. Anne looked out, seeing Bravo's smoke and flames now blotting out the sky. She heard the faint groans from the hold, the nurse's pleas. Time was gone. She knew Delta 2 was their only shot. The strip was short, narrow, and surrounded by debris, but she'd studied it. She knew every angle, every rough patch, every wind pattern from her display flights. "She could do this, sir," she said one last time, voice low but cutting like a blade. "If you don't land." "I will." Banks stared at her, his eyes a mix of rage and fear. He opened his mouth, then fell silent, his hands loosened on the yoke, as if admitting he couldn't go on. Anne didn't hesitate. She gripped the controls, feeling the C-47's weight in her hands. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clearer than ever. She knew what was coming would define her, not as the decorative pilot, but as a true pilot, born for this moment. The plane tilted slightly as she adjusted course, aiming for Delta 2. Through the window, she saw flashes of fire from nearby explosions, smoke rising from rubble. The auxiliary strip appeared ahead, a narrow, uneven strip, barely wide enough for a perfect landing. One mistake, and the C-47 would crash into the debris. No survivors. But Anne didn't think of failure. She thought of the 12 wounded, the nurse praying in the back, the jeers she'd endured. She would prove them wrong. She spoke through the intercom, her voice clear in the cockpit. "Nurse, brace everyone. We're landing." No time for a reply. She focused entirely, eyes locked on Delta II, hands guiding the yoke with an artist's precision. Smoke, fire, and distant artillery blasts didn't distract her. She was ready to do what no one dared. And in that moment, Lieutenant Anne Calloway was no longer the underestimated girl. She was the one at the controls, the one deciding the fate of all aboard. Lieutenant Anne Calloway gripped the yoke, her breathing steady, but her heart pounding like a war drum. The C-47 Skytrain hurtled toward Delta II, a narrow, uneven strip of dirt surrounded by smoke, fire, and debris from German artillery. Outside the cockpit window, flames flickered, black smoke swirled, and distant explosions echoed like the pulse of war. 30 seconds to landing, and everything rested on her. Captain Raymond Banks sat beside her, silent, hands limp, eyes vacant, a man who'd given up. Anne didn't look at him. She had no time to think of him or the jeers she'd endured. She thought only of the 12 wounded soldiers in the back, the nurse praying, and the slim runway looming ahead. She adjusted the yoke, tilting the right wing at a precise angle, executing a side slip, a maneuver few pilots dared in these conditions. Gusts from the valley hit hard, making the C-47 shudder violently. But Anne held firm, eyes locked on the rough strip below. She recalled every detail of Delta II, from her flyovers, the bumpy start, the slight slope in the middle, a pile of wreckage hugging the right edge. She had to land perfectly, not a meter off. One mistake, and the plane would plunge into fire or shatter. "Nurse, secure the straps," Anne barked through the intercom, her voice sharp yet calm. No time for a reply. She lowered altitude, deployed the landing gear, and adjusted speed with absolute focus. Smoke from nearby explosions clouded the runway, but she didn't panic. She felt the plane as an extension of herself, with every vibration and every engine hum guiding her. She heard faint groans from the hold, the nurses shout, "Hurry! They can't hold on!" Anne clenched her jaw, refusing to let emotion take over. She had one shot, meters from the ground. A shell exploded beside the runway, spraying dirt and rock like rain. The C-47 wobbled, but Anne corrected instantly, keeping the wings level. She eased the yoke, lifting the nose just as the wheels kissed the earth. The tires screeched against the dirt, the plane skidding along the narrow strip, jolting over rough patches. Anne held the yoke tight, eyes tracking the runway's edge, where the wreckage sat just 3 meters from the right wing. She slowed, hit the brakes, and the C-47 halted, its nose 3 meters from the debris, a flawless landing. Silence fell. In the cockpit, Banks gasped, as if waking from a nightmare. Anne released the yoke, her breathing slowing, but she didn't relax. She turned to Banks, voice low but clear. "Sir, we've landed. The nurse needs help now." Without waiting, she yanked off her headset, opened the cockpit door, and stepped into the hold. The nurse was crying, hands trembling as she checked the wounded. "They're alive." She choked out, "All of them." A soldier, racked with pain, grabbed Anne's hand, whispering, "Thank you, ma'am." Anne nodded, her gaze soft but resolute. Outside, the Naples base went quiet. Soldiers and ground crew stood frozen, disbelieving. The C-47 rested intact on Delta II amid smoke and ruin. No one thought any pilot, let alone a woman branded Decorative, could land in those conditions. A soot-streaked controller muttered, "I've seen top pilots refuse Delta II." How'd she do it? No one answered. They just watched Anne, helping the nurse unload the wounded, her small frame commanding respect. In that moment, the whispers and pitying glances vanished. Anne Calloway didn't need medals or praise. She'd done what no one dared. And that was enough to change everything. But her story wasn't over. What she did on Delta II would spread, not through newspapers or ceremonies, but through hushed tales among pilots, mechanics, and soldiers who'd seen it. She didn't just save 12 lives, she redefined what a true pilot could be. Dawn broke over the Naples base, pale golden light filtering through the lingering smoke from last night's artillery. The C-47 Skytrain stood quietly on Delta II's auxiliary runway, its fuselage dusted lightly, but intact, a silent witness to the miracle that unfolded. Lieutenant Anne Calloway stepped out of the barracks, her uniform slightly rumpled but her eyes sharp, untouched by fatigue. She sought no attention, no praise. She just wanted to check the plane again, a true pilot's habit. But as she neared, she paused. On the fuselage, someone had painted in white, scrawled but clear. "She's not here to smile, she's here to fly." Anne stood still, staring at the words. A faint smile crossed her lips, but she said nothing. She grabbed a rag and wiped the paint clean, as if erasing the moment's mark. She didn't need praise scrawled on a plane. For her, the 12 wounded soldiers safely in the field hospital were enough. But she didn't know that the words, though erased, had spread. Mechanics, soldiers, and pilots whispered about it, about the woman who landed on Delta II, a strip no one dared touch. The mission report submitted to command was brief: emergency landing successful. Aircraft secure, all wounded evacuated. Co-pilot assumed landing control. No mention of Anne Calloway, no details of the smoke, the narrow runway, or the moment she took the yoke from Captain Banks. No medal, no press conference, not even a formal handshake. Anne didn't expect those things. She returned to work, checking engines, logging flights, prepping for the next mission, as if last night was just another day. But the base was different. The pitying glances once aimed at her were gone. The mocking whispers in the mess hall had stopped. In their place was quiet respect. A combat pilot, a casino veteran, quietly sent her an old map, Delta II circled in red. Beneath it he wrote, "Only the brave touch this strip." And one did. Anne kept the map, tucking it into her uniform pocket, but showed no one. She just smiled, her eyes gleaming with silent pride. Captain Banks, who'd sat silent in the cockpit that night, never spoke of Delta II. He flew on, commanded on. But when asked about the flight, he said only, "Ask Calloway. She knows." It was his way of admitting, not with praise, but with the silence of a man who'd been wrong. Anne didn't need more from him. She'd proven everything, not to Banks, not to the base, but to herself. Anne's story spread to other bases, not through newspapers, but over coffee, in pilot chatter during breaks. "That girl landed on Delta II," they said, voices awed, in smoke and fire with 12 wounded, and she did it. Each time she heard it, Anne just bowed her head and kept working. She didn't need glory. She knew her worth, and that was all that mattered. No one thought Anne Calloway would dare land on that deadly strip, but she did. And because she dared, 12 men didn't die. Her courage came not from gender, not from praise, but from choosing to do what was right when no one else would. She walked through the base, sunlight on her shoulders, and though no one said it aloud, they knew Anne Calloway wasn't just a pilot. She was a quiet hero who wrote history with her hands on the yoke, with a heart that never yielded. Lieutenant Anne Calloway stepped into the sunset, her silhouette blending with the planes waiting on the runway. She didn't chase glory, but her story of courage, of standing tall under doubting eyes, would echo on. It's the story of unsung heroes who need no medals to know their value. Anne proved that courage has no limits, and sometimes one brave choice can change everything. If Anne's journey moved you, share this story to spread her legacy. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a comment. What did you think of the moment she took the yoke? We want to hear your thoughts. Let's amplify the extraordinary together, and we'll see you in the next video.